right. Welcome back to another episode of Women's Wellness Wisdom. And I'm so excited for what Adrienne and I have lined up for you today because I think this is something so many women don't hear about. So I'm Dr. Jenny Cortano, and we're going to dive right in. Functional medicine practitioner, previously PT, and a huge advocate of women's health and particularly women not getting the right information to really serve their health. And so, Adrienne, go ahead and introduce yourself and let's talk about what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I'm Adrienne Roth. I'm an OT by trade, but I have my certification in functional medicine. And my journey starts right here with what we're going to talk about today, with
Yeah.
looking at our period as a vital sign.
Yes.
When we're talking about health, we always think about we go to the doctor, we look at our heart rate, our blood pressure, our temperature, our respiratory rate. But what we really don't consider is that our period is basically a vital sign. It's like our monthly report card that helps us check in on how our body's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important, right? Because it impacts or is impacted by so many systems, right? So, whereas something like our blood pressure really tells us about our cardiovascular system, heart rate, cardiovascular system. When we talk about period, we are talking about adrenals, we're talking about hormones, we're talking about other systems in the body, gut health, potentially. There's just so many things that play into what happens during our period and what that looks like. And so, it can really give us a big picture of healthy versus unhealthy.
And I'd even like to say that when we look at our period, right, it might be that first warning sign. Like our heart rate might not be affected, our blood pressure might not be affected by some of these changes in our body, but our period is going to be that first warning of like, hey, something's not going right. We need to look a little bit deeper, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are those things that you start to hear from folks? Or maybe let's back up 1 minute and talk about what is a healthy period? What does that typically
Yeah.
look like?
So
Or
when
what
we're
should
looking
it
at
look like?
it does vary from person to person, right?
For
So
sure.
what each
For
of our
sure.
normal is a little different, but I think our what we really want to highlight here too is what's not normal. So
Hmm.
when we talk about a period, we want it to be around 28 to 38 days or our whole cycle. And then our period should be
Hmm.
between 3 and 7 days. You want a moderate flow, nothing too heavy or too light, and you should ovulate every month with that. So when we start to look at abnormal periods, right, we don't want to see a ton of PMS. Like we've been told over and over
Yes.
again, we're just PMSing and the whole week before our period almost. I feel like when we were young, we were told like, that's just part of it. Or severe cramps that were debilitating cramps that we can't get out of bed, or we're soaking through a pad in a matter of an hour or two. These are
Yes.
all things that I was told was
Yeah.
normal that aren't
Sure.
necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that like energy changes
Yes.
and just like emotional regulation, right? Like, and I think that goes with that. You're just PMSing, but like that is not normal to have big fluctuations in how you feel based on where you are throughout your cycle. Might be common, but it doesn't mean it's normal.
Totally. And I think too, whereas like, right, a little bit of fluctuation may be normal, I think
Yes.
we've just turned it into a blanket of, hey, it's just part of it and we have to live with
Sure.
it, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think, to your point, right? My cycle has been very regular for a long time, largely in part because of all the things that I do, right? And that's a vital sign
Yeah.
I track. And this month it was off, but I was traveling. I had some really stressful stuff
Yes.
coming up, right? So there are times where some atypical cycle symptoms are normal, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go back to normal or shouldn't kind of be able to explain why those variations happen.
And to your point, right, I think it's a good opportunity to self-reflect. So
Yeah.
your cycle's a little off this month. Okay, what kind of was going on? Am I missing some of the nutrition I usually, or some of the food I eat? And my nutrition's a little off. Am I extremely stressed?
Mhm.
And you can kind of assess to attack the next month, like what can I change here,
Sure.
before it has long-term health effects, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've touched on kind of what that normal looks like, and we've touched on some of the things that we think are missed when it comes to normal. But what are some of the big red flags we look at or our listener should listen to in terms of maybe these are things that might be telling me about something else bigger in my health? I've got a couple, and
Yeah.
I know you do too.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I would say my first big one is if you're missing a period or you're having irregular periods.
Yeah.
That is the biggest red flag that something is a little bit off. And I mean, when we look at missing a period, chronic stress
Yep.
contributes to that, under eating, over exercising.
Yes.
thyroid dysfunction. Sometimes it's an indicator of PCOS. And I would even say as like a teenager, something missing my period was something I almost looked forward to, right? Like it was like, I don't have to deal with it this month. And when in reality, it was snowballing to a much bigger problem
Yeah.
due to over exercising and under eating and all those things.
Sure.
I don't know. I'll let you take on the next one.
Yeah, no. Well, I just want to add to that because you mentioned that it could be a sign of PCOS, right? Which has now been renamed,
Yes,
thankfully,
I love
to
that.
reflect the actual metabolic problems that it is. And so I have worked with more than one young lady who hit her late teen years and still hadn't started her period. And while that was seen as such a positive thing in her life,
Yeah.
right? Just to your point, for a long time, it started to kind of add up and add to the picture that maybe you aren't a traditional PCOS case, but you certainly fit based on the new criteria and then just also the fact that your cycle has never been normal and it should be by now.
Right. And I mean, as you said, it's been recategorized and named to be a metabolic
Yeah.
syndrome, right? We always talk about insulin and insulin resistance, and that just has such a domino effect on your body,
Yes.
starting with
Absolutely.
the period. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So I think another one that I think is a misconception is that your periods should be really, really heavy or really, really light, right? Or like
mhm.
any variation in that of like my bleeding is not normal. And so to kind of dive into that a little bit more, it's pretty typical to have a day or two of heavier bleeding followed by a couple of days of light bleeding. And where I see that being problematic is if you're getting a lot of kind of like almost like brown discharge before your period can be a sign of low progesterone, for example, can tell us some things about that. Or if you're bleeding through tampons in a very, very rapid rate, that can tell us some other things about your period. And so, having that kind of normal, it comes on, you bleed normally, you're not soaking through pads and pants and everything else. And then it lightens up and then in a couple of days it's gone is normal. And so for outside of that, whether that's too light or too heavy, I think that would be a concern.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And really, when we look at periods too, that's something where we want to consider uterine health too. So that could also be
Right?
indicative of endometriosis or other things that you want to dig a little deeper into as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you? Any others that you would add to this list that you think are important we haven't talked about yet?
Let's see. Okay, so this is another, we've touched on this at the beginning, PMS.
Yeah.
I feel like it's just always been no, or it's always been talked about that we're moody leading up to our periods. We should have these big mood swings. It's totally normal. And in reality, we should be, I mean, we might experience a little bit of an emotional change or feel a little bit of fatigue due to the changing hormone levels,
Yeah.
but overall, you should be relatively stable. So, when we look at severe PMS, it could be caused by blood sugar imbalances, stress, as we talked about, impacts
Mhm.
PMS, poor sleep, nutrient deficiencies. Um, PMS is kind of a sign that your body just may be struggling with these normal hormonal shifts for one reason or another, not
Sure.
necessarily normal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of hand in hand with that is cramps, right? Like we hear
Yeah.
these, oh, I'm PMSing and I've got these horrible cramps. Like those go hand in hand. And so I think, symptom wise, it's a lot of the same. But I would add to this one that it can definitely be a risk or a concern if you've kind of got in your mind a question of do you have endometriosis, right? Because
Mhm.
that tissue, again, in the uterine lining and the health of that should be kind of all in one place. And so when we start to get tissue that's growing outside of that uterus, growing into other tissue, and maybe isn't always like picked up on clinically right away, but this can be a sign or at least part of that story. Now, obviously, there can be less scary things as well, like hormone imbalances, which are a little easier to address. But I think that's always something when I hear terrible, cramps, doubled over in pain. Nutritionally, there are things we can do to support that, and it may be as simple as that, but it could be a far more complex and concerning thing as well.
And I would say that like my generation when we were growing up, a lot of the solutions were birth control, right? Let's just
Yes.
take it the pill and eliminate the cycle. However, we're finding as we're getting off birth control and trying to have kids and things, we've missed that these signals that our bodies have been sending us for a while that were actually indicative of some
Yeah.
other underlying deficiency, condition, or something like that. And we're trying to unpack that as we want to have children or move on with our life or do other things with our life. And so it's just really I would urge you that if you have these symptoms, to explore a little deeper
Yeah.
before blanket covering them up with something else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one more worth mentioning here, and we kind of talked about it at the beginning, but that like terrible fatigue or just like more than just
Mm,
fatigue, right? But like no energy, like can't get out of bed, could sleep all day, maybe even changes in like coloration of skin can definitely be signs of different types of nutritional deficiencies, maybe related to your iron, maybe related to thyroid. And all of those are impacted by our hormones as well. And so, when we see those things with cycles, I always am concerned when somebody writes those off. And again, this isn't
yeah.
just like well, I just had a really long day, I'm tired. It's a different level of fatigue, and it's opportunity to look deeper.
Mm,
So I think those are kind of, I would say, my top five of things that people oftentimes will say are normal, but are definitely
mm.
concerns. And so I guess kind of moving next, like what are things generally that you do to kind of keep that vital sign or keep your cycle healthy and keep it in check? And I know we've dove into this a lot, but just kind of a general thought process behind this.
Yeah. So I would say the first thing to do is start tracking your cycle. I think, right, having just seeing it on an app or paper or something and understanding kind of what's happening can give you a lot of insight on your health. I think it can also, while we say cycles vary between people, they should be relatively consistent within the same person, granted life factors, so that can help
Sure.
you
Yeah.
understand more of what's going on.
Yeah.
A big one for me and women, and I don't know if you've seen this, is prioritizing protein. I feel like us we as
Yeah.
women sometimes we just don't get enough protein. Um, do you have any, Jenny, that you feel like?
No, I mean, I think nutrition in general is a huge one, right? Because
Yeah,
there are certain things we can eat throughout our cycle that are really going to help. But you're right, like protein and having enough iron rich foods are two big ones, I think, that from a cycle perspective, just generally keeping it healthy, right? And then there are so many other cofactors and nutrients that are important, things like zinc, and, are needed for different pieces. Vitamin C is huge for progesterone, things like that. So, generally it comes back to eating the rainbow and eating a nice, healthy variety of foods, right? But having enough of those nutrients specific for your cycle.
well, and actually, this is something we're both very passionate about, but we've created a course called Rhythm and Reset where we really
Yes.
dive into this for your cycle,
Yes.
the foods to support your cycle, the things that you can do to help support your cycle through these phases and maybe help with some of these things that
100%.
um, we're seeing. But
Yeah.
it's definitely an area
Well,
we're passionate about.
no, absolutely. And I was just going to say, right, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, but I don't even know, or I need more, or I've tried those things and that's not enough, our course is going to be launching really soon. And so this is a great place to start, right? It cracks the surface and dives into walking you through what are those things you should be paying attention to? How do you start tracking them? And not just what are we tracking, but how are we fixing it?
Yeah.
So I'm super excited about this because it's done for you. You don't have to join anything. You can pick it up online when you have time, and it's going to help set you up for success in setting up your cycle for whatever's next, whether that's just managing life without symptoms, whether that's pregnancy or going into perimenopause. I think all of those things are covered in the way we present it in that course.
And I think I really want to nail this into your cycle is not just indicating your fertility, right? Like it is
Yes.
for your fertility, but it's also like, again, you're indicating your overall health. And your symptoms are not random. They're not just here
No.
for no reason. They're indicating something greater. So when you look at food, nutrition, sleep, stress, we can often improve both our hormone health and our overall wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a good note to end on. So if you've been wondering if your symptoms are normal, they're probably not. Common, maybe, but maybe not
Yeah.
normal. And so whether you want to work with us and figure out and get to the root of that, or you want to dive into our course, find us on social media or on our website, altogetherwellness.net, and we'll help you take those next steps. Until next time,
Have a great day.
bye.